Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special online forum, Too Hot to Handle, the Scorching Reality of Australia's Climate Security Failure, brought to you by the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. I'm Emily Rice, and I'm delighted to be your host for this very important conversation and online event. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet. For me specifically, it's the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge their continuing connection to country. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us. Today, we are here to confront the urgent implications of climate security in Australia and the wider world. Our focus will centre on the key insights derived from the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group's latest report, Too Hot to Handle. The report represents a comprehensive examination of the critical intersection between climate disruption and Australia's security landscape. Central to this analysis is the alarming lack of attention given by the federal government to the impact of climate change on our nation's defence priorities and community security. Now, if you haven't already, you can download the report. I already have at ASLCG.org. It's 32 pages long, very comprehensive, but also very digestible. Tonight, we have an expert group of panellists who will bring a wealth of experience and expertise to this conversation, and we encourage you, there's hundreds of you out there, to ask questions also at the conclusion of our speaker presentations. To participate later on, just drop your questions in the Q&A box and we'll see your questions after we hear from the speakers. And also, if you have a specific question for a specific speaker, please put that in your question as well. Firstly, may I introduce Admiral Chris Barry, former Chief of the Australian Defence Force. Admiral Barry's distinguished career in the military has provided him with unique insights into the intersection of climate change and national security. I now invite Admiral Chris Barry to provide some opening remarks, about 5 minutes worth. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks, Emily. It's a delight to be able to make the opening remarks at this very important seminar, because I had hoped when the Albanese government came into office in 2022, we wouldn't have to put out a report like Too Hot to Handle. The Security Leaders Climate Group began work in late 2021. And that was a time when we thought we could influence government policy. We were very concerned about the Morrison government going forward to Glasgow and not appreciating the importance of what the science was telling us and the need for urgent action. Also, that was a time when a former colleague, Professor Will Steffen, said once to me and to a wider audience that by 2030, we will know the answer between extinction or survival. When I look back now and I think about Will's life and the contribution he made to the science that we're now trying to promote, I think Will may have got the sense of timing wrong. It might be actually earlier than 2030 when we know that answer. But I'd couple that with the simple point that between now and that time, there will be 2 federal government elections in Australia. And that is one of the reasons why, in my mind, the next election in Australia, probably likely to be in May 2025, will be a climate change election. It's not too late, but the time is evaporating quickly on which to take all the steps we need to take hold of the problem and stop it becoming existential. Moreover, our experience since 2021, leading up to the election in 2022 and since, is the bureaucracy in Australia has lost its skills in dealing with climate change. There's a propensity to deal with the issues in silos, the Defence Department on one hand, the Department of Home Affairs on another, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, and so on yet another. In addition, a major plank from the Security Leaders Climate Group has been the requirement to carry out a national climate security risk assessment. We had hoped this would be a nationwide effort driven by top-level leadership from politics, business and on, and that it would involve our communities all around Australia that have suffered from the consequences of climate change and its impacts. But what's happened is it's transformed now into a bureaucratic exercise. We're now in phase 2 of that National Climate Security Risk Assessment. Phase 1 outcomes were delivered in December last year, and we think we've got so much time to get to the end of phase 2 before we appreciate the policy issues that are urgent as priorities and then start finding the resources to deal with them. The complexity of the issues we're trying to confront are enormous. Everything is interweaved, and that is why the siloed approach will not work. I think we need some better governance arrangements to bring everything together and make it very clear about who needs to do what to try and deal with our future. It is our future security we're trying to deal with. It's the security of Australian young people. It's not my generation. It's not going to affect people like me. But I think our youngsters need to galvanise the effort to direct their concerns at government, at politicians, at business, and wherever they deal inside our communities. And finally, I don't think we should dismiss too easily the resourcefulness and the resilience of the Australian community. We have seen it reach up when needed to deal with these problems. But the great difficulty I conceive of at the moment is no one is setting those problems out in ways that make this manifestly so important. Our priorities need to be set firmly on dealing with the economic and the political and the societal issues that climate change consequences are going to deliver in the Australia of the future. I look forward to hearing from our experts who assembled the Too Hot to Handle report. It is an important report that is built on our previous reports and urge people with interests in agriculture, other security measures, and so on, to download those reports as they might have time to read them. Nonetheless, let me finish by simply saying the time is running out. There are just 2 elections to go, and that's why it's so disappointing we have to talk about a report called Too Hot to Handle. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And you're right, too hot to handle. We'll talk a little bit more about it being so hot to handle that we're still waiting for the federal government to address many of the key concerns in that report. For those who didn't catch the media last week featuring Chris's press interviews, he was very busy. I highly recommend you have a read, and you can find these, all the latest media, on the ASLCG website under latest media. Next, we're joined by David Spratt, the Research Director for Safe Climate Australia. David has a deep understanding of climate science and policy, and he's going to offer some invaluable insights into the multifaceted risks posed by the climate emergency. David will elaborate on some of the specific risks outlined in the report and how they're impacting Australia and the region's security landscape. And thank you for those people popping questions in. You've got plenty of time to do so. We probably won't start taking questions until around 1:30. But thank you for acting so quickly. Please welcome David Spratt.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to all who've joined this event. Let me just share my screen. So people, I think, will know that in the last year, a lot that has happened in the world of climate change has shocked scientists. In the last year, we've seen warming. We've seen evidence, which is now very clear, that the rate of warming has accelerated from 0.2 degrees per decade to 0.3 degrees per decade, as you can see in the chart below. This year will be likely as warm as last year was, which was 1.5 degrees, the lower end of the Paris Agreement, a figure which I think shocked a lot of people in the scientific community. And it's likely that accelerated warming will continue for decades to come for reasons which I can elaborate in the Q&A if required. Perhaps the world's most eminent climatologist, James Hansen, says that he thinks 2 degrees is likely by 2040. Of course, we're effectively at 1.5 now, and we're heading for 3 degrees of more. And certainly lessons from climate history, from paleoclimatology, would tell us that that's the case. The net zero 2050 paradigm is too little, too late. And the Australian government's National Climate Risk Assessment, which Chris just talked about, proposes that warming will be 1.5 to 2 degrees by 2050. And I think that is now dangerously outdated because the system is heating up and accelerating, and we need to rethink many of these things. The risks, as the UN Secretary General has said, the US Defense Secretary has said, are existential. That is, that they will create large global irreversible harm. The risks are greatest at the top end or fat end of the outcome range. That is, we should give particular attention to the high end or worst case scenarios. The climate system is exhibiting fast non-linear change, which I will illustrate in the next chart by the way of looking at tipping points. That is, things are happening faster than scientists expected and in ways which are difficult to project. Those tipping points, which you'll see in a moment, may trigger unforeseen events. And those risks in a very complex physical biochemical system are interconnected and intensifying and will cascade across both the natural systems and the human systems, as we've seen with issues to do with food and food crises around the world at the moment. And this requires a systems-based approach to understanding them, looking at the system as a whole and then working down to the particular. But there is no sign of this approach permeating the government's work in the Defence Strategic Review and the Defence Strategy. So just to give an example, the circles illustrate tipping points well identified by scientists and the arrows, their connections. Now, 20 years ago, scientists in the IPCC would have said that none of those tipping points will become active this century. I remember back in 2007, when the Arctic sea ice started disappearing rapidly, a scientist exclaimed, "It's happening 100 years ahead of schedule." In fact, the scientist was behind the physical reality. And now we're seeing that tipping points have passed through the Arctic sea ice. That has destabilized Greenland, which is now accelerating at a rapid rate. That Greenland pouring fresh water into the North Atlantic is slowing down the Atlantic circulation, the AMOC, which we'll talk about. That change is desertifying the Eastern Amazon. And so we see this connectivity between tipping points across the system. Of course, in Australia right now, we've seen half the barrier reef essentially dying or dead from the worst bleaching event on record. And in Antarctica, there's now clear evidence that tipping points have been fast. So this is a different story to one that scientists expected even 10 or 20 years ago. So it's time for government to rethink the approach to climate risk and embrace a complex risk analysis systemically from the top down. That means taking into account the full range of outcomes, not the middle of the range probabilities, but the worst possibilities and the plausible worst case scenarios. This is important because the greatest damage is at the high end. It's important not to unduly rely on models, but to use expert opinion and scenario planning. The urgency of action should be explicitly required. The lack of certainty should not be taken as an excuse for inaction. And the precautionary principle, the need for precautionary action should be taken into account. So that's something the report goes into some detail about how the government should think about these risks. Now, let me get to some practical examples. Some work that came out in the last couple of years described a zone at 2.7 degrees. And remember, we're at 1.5 now. By 2055, roughly, on the present indications, will be at 2.7. And science described areas of the world in red which humans have never previously experienced. Before global warming, they said this level of what they called near unlivable heat could be only found on 0.8 of the world's surface, that is basically in the Sahara. And now you see the spread of this red area by 2060, where for all intents and purposes, unless you're in an air-conditioned tractor, in an air-conditioned office, in an air-conditioned tank, you will not be able to survive outside during hot days. And if you look at those areas and how they're spread, and remember, science is saying these areas are unlivable. And then you look at the US National Intelligence Council report from 2021 on where they identified areas which are highly vulnerable to climate change. You look at South Asia, Pakistan, India, you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you look at the Pacific, they're precisely the same areas as in this map. And 2 days ago, I came across these maps from May the 6th, where there's record-breaking heat in India and global average temperatures in India are now hitting 45 degrees. One of those areas of concern. On the same day, look at Sub-Saharan Africa, the same situation, those wide areas of 45 plus levels of warming. Now, that is going to cause enormous food crisis. We know last year that India stopped all export of rice because of domestic problems driven by extreme heat and a drop in their rice production. In 2021, the Chatham House UK Climate Risk Assessment said by 2050, global food demand will be 50% higher than at present, but crop yields may be 30% lower. And that equation is essentially global chaos, an escalating global food crisis. And the Chatham House conclusion was that these impacts, amongst others, would drive political instability and greater national insecurity and fuel regional and international conflict. And I think that is now well accepted. In fact, the Security Leaders Group 2 years ago put out a report called Food Fight, which looked precisely at these issues of food shortage, water insecurity leading to human and global insecurity. So let's look a little bit more closely at that area in our part of the world of essentially unlivable heat. And there will be extreme heat impacts on rice yields. At 45 to 47 degrees, rice dies, and you're looking at 45 degrees plus in India at the moment. So they are probably about to have a terrible rice crisis. At 30 to 34 degrees, rice, in the flowering period, rice yields drop remarkably. And most of Southeast Asia is experiencing extreme heat at the moment. These will lead to the breakdowns of civil society, conflict and state failure in many of our key Indo-Pacific partner states. And when you look at that map, you see Papua New Guinea, you see Indonesia, you see the Philippines, you see India, Pakistan, Myanmar, Thailand, people that we are establishing our security framework with. These problems are not articulated in any of the government defence and security initiatives. And I fear that we're building security alliances with states that will simply collapse. One of the other case studies we did was looking at Northern Australia, and as is illustrated here, a large number of our military bases are in the north, in that red area of unlivable heat. The government has just committed another $22 billion to improving the capacity of those bases. Of course, you can fight a war in places where you don't want to live, but these places will be essentially unlivable for children, for families. These areas, these red areas, will suffer breakdown in infrastructure due to heat. They will suffer from depopulation. It will not be possible to live there. If you look at some of the key areas where we have our bases, you're talking about 200 to 300 days a year over 35. You're talking about perhaps 100 days over 40 degrees. And you're talking about the majority of the nights being over 25, which means that you don't get a decent night's sleep. And indeed, if we look at what's called the wet bulb temperatures, which looks at both heat and humidity, the same thing occurs. And you can see here that those areas in the darker red are essentially unlivable areas at 3 degrees of warming. Lastly, one of our other case studies was on the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, often called the Gulf Stream, which carries water from the tropics up the North American coast and into Europe, keeping particularly in northwestern Europe much warmer than it otherwise would be, where Neil lives. And there is now, I think, a widespread scientific acceptance that there's an unacceptable risk that the AMOC, which has already slowed 15%, will simply stop this century due to climate change, due to the impacts, particularly of Greenland, in interrupting that slow. Scientists in the UK call the disruption of the AMOC a going out of business scenario for European agriculture. It would also disrupt the monsoons in West Africa and South Asia. I mean, this is the event that frightens scientists most, a non-linear global event that will essentially disrupt everything. It will push rapid sea level rises on both sides of the Atlantic. Australia will become more warm and prone to flooding, and the wet and dry seasons in the Amazon would flip. And there's a fear, particularly in Russia and so on, that large areas for growing wheat and corn would dry out. So this is the sort of scenario that is simply missing in all the government's work. I had a look, and since in the period of this current government, not one member of the government or the opposition has uttered a single word in Parliament, made a single statement, or asked a single question about AMOC. So just to finish, I think it's really important to, as I've tried to do here, to reflect on the words of John Schellenhuber, the advisor, former advisor to the EU and to Angela Merkel, that political reality must be grounded in physical reality, or it's completely useless. And thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you, David, for shedding light on the stark but critical analysis. And we can see how much of your work's gone into the backgrounding of that report. I must admit, after hearing you speak, David, I do feel a bit nauseous. Yeah, it's pretty confronting stuff that you've gone through there. I mean, here in Melbourne, we panic when it's 2 days over 40, 100 days over 40. Just seems it's quite hard to comprehend. But jumping to our next speaker is Ian Dunlop, former chair of the Australian Coal Association. Ian has an extensive background in industry and climate policy, and that positions him well to provide us with an overview of the report and its key recommendations for those who haven't read through it thoroughly. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Emily. I'll just put my screen up here. Well, against the background that David's put forward, I'd like to now just look at our perspective in the report on the way the government has been approaching this whole issue of climate security risk assessments. So if we look at the background to ASLCG's involvement, we, as Chris said, we were formed in 2021. We particularly proposed that Australia should carry out a formal climate security risk assessment, and we put that to all political parties. The reason is that if you look at what is going on in the climate space globally, in my view, risk is not really being addressed. What we see is that whether it's governments, it's business, it's finance groups, they have all picked up the formal picture put out by organizations like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assumed that is a correct definition of risk, and hence you get the objective of net zero emission reductions by 2050, and everything else follows from it. And that is not looking at risk properly. You really have to go and look at the extremes and what have you, which I'll come to. So what we saw is that we were very pleased that the ALP before the election picked up that recommendation, and post-election it then committed to carrying it out. The only problem was that it was split into two issues. An assessment of external risks by the Office of National Intelligence, ONI, of the Department of Defence, and separately a focus on domestic risks with the Department of Climate Change through the National Climate Risk Assessment. We had suggested an integrated holistic approach for this, including various discussions we held with people like Chatham House in London, who'd done a lot of this work, and his methodology we were very keen on. So if you look then at what has happened subsequently, very briefly, the ONI work was completed between August and November in 2022 as input to the Defence Strategic Review. That was in turn released in April 2023, but had a minimal reference to climate, other than the fact that really the Australian Defence Force should minimise its involvement in relief activities, HADR activities. On the domestic front, the National Climate Risk Assessment kicked off at the beginning of that year in stage 1, which is a qualitative assessment of the domestic risks we were faced with. And the first stage report identified 56 of those risks. The second stage is now ongoing, and it is focused on a quantitative assessment of 11 of the priority risks identified in stage 1. Now, in addition to that, we have a national adaptation plan in train with an issues paper that's recently been, I think, submissions completed on, and a further piece of work on how climate risk should be managed in the public sector. And then finally, we had the National Defence Strategy released just recently in April, which has minimal reference to climate at all. And the main focus particularly is on amongst others, on expanding the northern bases, as David had said. So if you rank all of that, we took an overview in the report of all of the reports I've just touched on, a couple of other things, and ranked them in terms of star rating on where we thought the government had got to. And frankly, we have to say objectively, it's not very impressive. We are not seeing climate risk taken seriously pretty much anywhere through the chain of command, as it were. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about the background to that. So the issues we saw in this is, first, there seems to be a limited understanding of what is now becoming an existential threat, and what in actuarial terms people talk about the risk of ruin as climate change is accelerating, because it is. And there's no question that what we've seen, as David's outlined, is quite dramatic change over the last couple of years. So climate's now a far greater threat to all nations and conventional geopolitics. And of course, we're tied up in the concern about the China threat here in Australia, particularly. Our view, quite simply, is climate is a much greater threat than China. And at the same time, we see a cameo role for climate in defence and security thinking. If you look at the Defence Strategic Review and the National Defence Strategy. A particular concern of ours has been the emphasis right the way through this work on adaptation, to the almost complete exclusion of mitigation. Adaptation is managing the unavoidable, mitigation is avoiding the unmanageable. And if you don't really mitigate, then you can't adapt to the conditions that are now being locked in. You've got to accelerate that mitigation. So we have a fundamental methodological flaw at the outset. And the adaptation, of course, depends on the extent of mitigation you're prepared to undertake. So we have been continually asking the question, well, why the artificial acceleration, a separation? It really should be combined. The third point is the question of systemic change David touched on. You've got to look at this as a total systemic problem. You can't just take bits of it. And I think what we see, one example, of course, is what's happened in splitting this work between the Department of Climate Change's National Climate Risk Assessment and the ONI Global Picture. The national work must be informed by what is happening globally. Otherwise, we're fooling ourselves, and instead what we're seeing is a bottom-up approach with people's historic perspective on risk, which is not the issue. The issue is what is going to happen going forward. So beyond that, it is critical to focus on the worst case scenarios. Anybody who's been involved in scenario planning, the whole point of it is to think about extremes. And with climate, that is where the problem exists. It's the extremes we really have to worry about. Yet we don't see this being contemplated in the work that is currently ongoing. We don't know what's in the ONI report. We hope it has been included, but that's not public at this point in time. But what we do see is that the scenarios, the 1.5, 2 degrees C by 2050 scenarios currently being used in the domestic work are out of date. And then I think coming through the reports thus far is there's no sense of urgency for climate action. I mean, by the time this work is completed, it will be 2 or 3 years from the election to completion of the domestic risk assessment process. And the ONI findings are still secret. The NCRA report really gave the impression in the way it was presented, there was really nothing to see here to prompt rapid action. We just move on to another part of the process in stage 2. And that's in direct contrast to what we see happening around the rest of the world with organizations like Chatham House, the EU Environment Agency with their own risk assessment in the last month or so, the World Economic Forum and so on, all of whom are urging accelerated action. And yet it's not coming through in our own discussions. Those are some of the specific concerns we had in the report. If you look at the broader issues, what we see, our focus has always been on human security. It must be central to the duty of government to protect the people. And securitizing climate threats through enhanced militarization and claims for national security secrecy are really not a coherent response to the challenge that's now facing us. Similarly, what we're seeing is through this work is that climate research in Australia is not planned or integrated in a manner that's delivering the right information to the right people. If it was, we wouldn't be doing the things we're currently doing. We'd be screaming from the rooftops that we really had to move this issue along far faster than we're seeing. And I think the final point is that, we really have to see emissions reduced far faster than the net zero by 2050 goal. We have to, in addition, draw down carbon from atmosphere, something that's not even talked about in our debate in Australia, and move on to looking at means of rapidly cooling parts of the planet on a proactive sense, rather than just responding to the symptoms, which is what we're tending to do, unfortunately. And finally, we've got current policies that clearly are not in line with the latest science. We have limited mitigation. We continue to expand fossil fuels when there is no carbon budget left, if you listen to any of the key experts around the world. And we are in denial about the existing climate impacts. And the Great Barrier Reef is now in a death spiral pretty much. And yet we still insist on trying to prevent it included on the UNESCO endangered list. You can't keep doing this. We have to be honest about what's happening. And finally, I think the community has to be fully informed on climate risk. We cannot have this topic treated secretly with the implications swept under the carpet. The ONI work, as we understand it, has not been incorporated into the National Climate Risk Assessment. So we seem to be spinning our wheels and creating a whole lot of extra work which could have been avoided. And of course, increasing the amount of time it takes us to come and get on top of these problems. Finally, I think the critical issue is that we have to have unprecedented global cooperation to solve climate. Conflict is not going to get us there. And unfortunately, around the world, we are moving in precisely the wrong direction at this point in time. We need leaders who are prepared to speak out about this and start to really develop the momentum to turn the ship in the opposite direction, because if we don't, we really have no hope of moving forward. So what we need, I think, in Australia is an integrated national climate security strategy, pulling all these threads together. The sort of recommendations we put into the report are not that difficult. I won't go through them all in great detail here, but essentially it means improving our awareness of the risks that are now facing us and starting to really get a much faster and prioritized response to moving the debate in this country forward. So the bottom line of all of this is you really cannot solve a problem like this, which is in fact the greatest threat humanity has ever faced, without talking about it honestly and leading the conversation. And the government, unfortunately, is really not doing that yet. We would hope that these sort of conversations might encourage that essentially to change, because it needs to, and it needs to do so extremely quickly. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ian. It's clear time is not on our side, and it begs the question why this report is not being released. We might dig down into that in the Q&A session. But just a reminder of those key recommendations are on page 9 of the report, which is available to download now from the ASLCG's website. And of course, other past reports, Missing in Action and Food Fight, which Ian mentioned, are also available in the reports section. And time is not on our side either, but we do have one more speaker. Last but not least, Rear Admiral Neil Morissetti. Neil is a retired Royal Navy officer who now serves as a Professor of Climate and Resource Security at University of College London. His expertise will enrich our discussion, and he's joining us from London this evening with some key reflections and comments. Thank you very much, Neil.
Emily, thank you, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to join the panel. I'm acutely conscious that this important report was written by Australians, about Australia, for Australians, and I am not an Australian, and therefore perhaps I should proceed with a degree of trepidation. But the reality is this report describes the sort of problems that we're all facing. They're not unique to Australia, and as others have said, if we're going to address them, we need to do it in a collaborative fashion, drawing on each other's expertise. We elect our governments to look after our prosperity and well-being, or our national security. There's nothing new in that, and if you think about it, taxes were originally raised on that basis. So, in the same way that we expect governments to consider all the traditional threats we face, including potential state-on-state conflict, whether it be in the Asia-Pacific region or what we're seeing in Eastern Europe today, we have every right to expect them to look at the non-traditional, transboundary threats. Because if they don't, what you've got is a failure or an abdication of responsibility. And the result is a flawed approach to our national security. It's a flawed national security strategy. And Ian's report scorecard is not unique to Australia. That could be read across in many parts of the world. Climate change is one of those threats, and yet the governments in both hemispheres seem incapable of conducting a comprehensive threat analysis, which includes the impact of a changing climate, both domestically and internationally. I don't know what it is. They seem to be deaf to the many informed voices, you've talked about Chatham House and others, who are calling for action. But not only have they got to produce that comprehensive analysis, but they've got to be prepared to share it with those who need to know about it. We need to understand what's happening, what it means for our respective countries, and how we're going to act on it. So why is it we're not sharing it? Is it because the scale of the problem is too great? Well, if we don't do anything soon, it's going to be even bigger. Ditto the cost. Is it lack of certainty? David talked about certainty in his piece. We've got enough certainty about the impact of a changing climate to make a decision and get on with it now. Far more than we have for any other threat we face until it actually becomes reality. And I'm sure they're all coming into play, but I think there's a couple of other factors as well. Certainly in Europe, and I suspect in Australia, we have lost the capacity and potentially the capability to think strategically. And that's a bit of a challenge for us. We're a short-term tactical society, all about the immediate and minimal risk. And yet all the threats we face this century require strategic long-term thinking. We need to start to drive with those headlights on full beam and start to get back into that strategic thinking. And the other point, and it picks up on something that Chris Barry said, the security community appears to be struggling to carry out this risk analysis. And that's despite the fact that the principles that they need to use are exactly the same as any other threat we've seen in the past. You need to build a picture, you need to understand what it's telling you, and then you need to act on that information, and including exploiting the opportunities. But because climate change cuts across all elements of society, unlike other threats which may be quite discrete, it permeates all our ways of life, and addressing the risks requires more than one government department. We need to break out of that silo that Chris talked about. We've got to find new ways of collaborating, both domestically and internationally. At the end of the day, 21st century challenges need 21st century solutions, but importantly, they need to be addressed in a 21st century fashion. As the authors have said, it's a pity they had to write this report. It shouldn't have to, because I know from at least 15 years of being involved in the conversation in Australia and here in Europe, we've known enough to get on and do it. But if it has to be written, these are the right people to write it, because they know the stuff. They can write it in a language that policymakers and business can understand, and they can focus it on the problems that need to be done. And in particular, address this failure of leadership that we have seen in both hemispheres. But the target audience is broader than that, because we've all got a responsibility to hold our governments to account. And just as they expect truth to be spoken unto power, we can expect, and have every right to expect, power to level with us. Because at the end of the day, there is no security solution to climate change. There's just greater insecurity if we don't act. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you for connecting all the way from London today and keeping your presentation brief, as we're unbelievably only have about 15-20 minutes to go. So thank you, and we can circle back to some of those points that you made. But it is time to hear from our audience, and we'll jump straight into the Q&A box. If you do have questions, throw them in there, and also please mention who you'd like to answer the question, or I'll direct them to whom I think is most appropriate. But we'll start with Robert, who was in pretty early in the Q&A box, Robert Tulip. And this one might be for you, Ian. Can emission reduction make any difference to temperature in this decade? I fear the answer. Is direct climate cooling more important? Maybe start with the first part of that question.
Well, thanks, Emily. Yeah, Robert, I mean, I think the problem is the longer we leave it, the harder it is to obviously get temperatures down. I think, as you're aware, I mean, there's a lot of work going on cooling initiatives for various parts of the world, which we've been involved in discussions on. I think this is going to have to be one of the issues that is seriously looked at, because we're running out of time. I know there's a great deal of resistance to geoengineering, but there are ways of doing it, hopefully, which will have minimal negative impacts. So I think it's one of those things that inevitably needs more research, time spent on it, and may well become a reality in various parts of the world relatively quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I mean, I remember first reporting on this 10, 15 years ago, and it seems so far in the distance, but right now it's starting to feel extremely urgent, and you only have to live in certain parts of Australia to feel like it's already upon us, unfortunately. The next question I might give to you, Chris, and I'm going to put sort of two in one. Firstly, John Redmayne has asked, is it possible to find politicians who know what is happening with changing seasons and are willing to do something to reduce the causes in the near future? We'll start with that one, and then we have one from Richard, which is very much along the same lines of the political inaction. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, I think there are a range of issues attached here, and I've had the privilege of talking both to inquirers in the Parliament House and to a range of politicians from both of the major parties, the Greens and also the newly created Independents, which the major parties want to call Teals, as though they're a party. They're not a party. They are people who think independently. But I go back into the 2022 election, and the thing that really struck me was the Australian women who galvanised in particularly key coalition electorates when they had an independent candidate who was a woman that was prepared to stand. And I think what we see in today's Parliament now is a greater number of independents. And I'm wondering to myself whether we will have Labor women knocked off by independent candidates in the 2025 election. Because if I think about the way society works, the people who'll be most concerned about the kinds of issues that we think need dealing with are the women. And if women don't stand up and get counted, again, time is running short, and the only way we might manage this is to have more women in our decision-making processes. There is a question that suggests we might have a hung parliament with major parties not able to get enough seats. I'm not so sure that's the dire problem both of the major parties would like you to think it is. I think there are other democracies that work with a greater number of independents. But one of the things that has struck me since 2022 election is how the independently thinking people can come together and agree on initiatives they would like to see taken. And if there were more of them and they were more agreeable, I think we'd get a whole bunch of better outcomes. I just can't conceive that in a Westminster-based democracy like ours, where your local member is the representative you have in the Parliament, we can't get this done. But it does need an educated community. It does mean people to make their votes count. And it does mean fielding a whole range of new candidates that are going to have the energy and the interest to make a difference.
Well, since this report, Too Hot to Handle's only been out for a short time, any of the panelists can jump in here, but have you, and we won't be mentioning names, but have you had any positive feedback from not necessarily the federal government, but any other federal MPs, any independents? Is there has there been a response from them, or is it crickets from them as well?
Oh, look, I'll jump in there. I mean, certainly people who understand climate better, people like the Greens and the Teals are ringing up saying, good on you for putting out, this is a good report, can you give us a briefing on it? I think within the federal government, it will have been read with great interest, and there are some signs that they realise we're saying things that are true and relevant to the work that they're not doing at the moment. But as you say, it's probably a bit early to tell.
Okay, well, in terms of and while I've got you here, just in terms of that first question we had from John, while I've got you there, David, do you think, sorry, from Robert, can emission reduction make any difference in this decade, or do we need to look beyond that and look at those extremes?
Look, of course it makes a difference. I mean, if we go back in climate history, we will learn that the current level of greenhouse gases, if they were maintained in the long term, would be enough to produce 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, that red area that we saw. So we've already got enough up there now to do that. So it's absolutely imperative that we stop emitting greenhouse gases as quickly as possible. The great problem is that the big fossil fuel nations are all committed to increasing their fossil fuel production over the next 10 or 20 years. That is United States, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, Australia, all want to produce more. So it is absolutely imperative that we get to zero as fast as possible. That is absolutely necessary. But as Robert says, it is not sufficient because the level of greenhouse gases is already too high. It is already too hot. So it is important to go to zero fast, but we must also do the sort of things which we know we can do to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and look at the work, for example, that Sir David King and his group at the Climate Crisis Action Group at Cambridge is doing, to see if there are ways to cool parts of the climate system to stop Greenland melting so fast, to stop the Atlantic circulation stopping. So those three elements are all necessary, and we don't make a choice between them. We have to do all three.
Thanks, David. I'll just jump to Neil, who joins us with a broader, I guess, or more international perspective. Neville's got a question. What other countries are taking tipping points, risks, and so on seriously? And who does have a proper adaptation plan?
I think around the world, it's a bit of a curate's egg. There are lots of individuals and small groups who are looking at these issues and raising them. We've heard about some of them today. The difficulty is that I can't think of any government who is taking this really seriously. And I'm not sure, as I was explaining, I'm not sure why, except I think they are so focused on the short term. I think they are at capacity. And that they're unable to do it. All the knowledge we need to get on and do this is around. The information's in the room. We've just got to find a way of making people wake up and smell the coffee without having a strategic shock. So I'm afraid I can't offer a beacon for all of us to follow. What I would say, though, is that through the collaboration of various communities, we are seeing some progress in the sense of the exchange of knowledge and exchange of information. And we've got to keep pursuing those if we're going to get anywhere.
Right. A question from Deepad, and this might be for you, Chris or Ian. Are there any political pathways to get the government, or shall we say force the government, to have the risk assessment released? Do we have a right to know? How can we actually force the government to be more open with this? Or does that come ahead of a 2025 election? What levers are there to push?
Well, we've been pushing to have the Office of National Intelligence assessment released, I guess, since not long after it was finalised. I mean, the fact is the government have taken the view that this is a report that is classified, that O&R reports are always that way. And they didn't want to set a precedent, as we understand it, by changing that. Now, the problem is that this is not a typical national security issue. This is a question of the far broader human security. As Chris has said, it is absolutely critical that the community is aware of what is actually the threat we're facing. And we don't see it coming through yet in the domestic risk assessment work. Maybe it will, but it will require fundamental change for that to happen. We hope that it has been put into the Office of National Assessment work. We have our own thoughts on what is in that, which we have published. But I think the reality is that since the election in 2022, what we've seen around the world is a dramatic acceleration in the impact of climate. There is no question that we're now seeing things that weren't even contemplated back in those days. And this has to produce a changed attitude, I think, across the board, whether it be government, in business, in community sectors and so on, because we're going to have to change an awful lot to get on top of this problem, economically, socially, and so on. It needs far wider change than is currently being contemplated in our national debate. So in terms of how do you force the issue? Well, I think the more open discussion there is on the challenge we're now facing, the better. The more the facts are on the table, the better. And the more groups that get involved in doing that. And also, I think, pointing out the legal implications of this, because what governments are getting into now is the fact that they're going to incur legal liability for things they did not tell their communities when they knew perfectly well the situation. Now, that's been around for a long time, but it's becoming much more pointed with the type of situation we now have, where this work is being done. And you have to say, well, why have we never done a climate risk assessment in the past in this country? Well, a large part of the reason, frankly, is because people didn't want to know. Because if you know, you have to do something. If you don't know, then you can pretend you don't have to do anything. And that's been the position we've had in the climate wars for the last 30 years. That's changing. But this risk assessment must be done properly.
Sorry, Ian. Emily, if I can just jump in briefly there, pursuant to what Ian said. I mean, I think we can assume that the ONI report, which the government has refused to release, was very forthright. It caused some shock and awe amongst the few cabinet ministers who saw it. It didn't suit the government's narrative, which was the security narrative that China was the biggest threat. When this report, if it got out in public, people would be shocked. But I mean, this is not a question of hope and fear. This is an issue of necessary, crisp, frank analysis. And so that's one of the reasons in this report that's just been put out, Too Hot to Handle, one of the proposals, which I hope the Greens or the Teals or some people who really hook into this report, one of the proposals is to establish a climate threat intelligence unit within the intelligence community with an output including an annual declassified briefing to Parliament. So I would hope that the Teals or Greens or people who care would actually put legislation to the Parliament to set up that climate threat intelligence branch, because we need it. And if the Labor Party wants to say we don't need it, then that would be a debate in Parliament. But I think there are some concrete legislative steps that we can take to make these things a reality.
We can take, the politicians can take.
Well, we can urge our politicians to take, and there. I mean, I talk to Labor backbenchers who say, "Oh, David, you're right, but I'm not on the cabinet." I mean, there is a bit of a split brain thing here, where in a private conversation, they'll talk about their grandchildren and their fears for the future. So, if there is a move by Teals and Greens, and people who can be more forthright, maybe a few of those Labor backbenchers will think about their grandchildren first, and not what the Prime Minister's office is telling them the talking points are for the day.
Yeah, well, by the sounds of your report too, it's not their grandchildren they're worried about, it's probably their children.
Indeed.
And Chris, sorry, I can see you nodding along there. Can you give me your thoughts, please?
I just want to add to all of this, my take on what I'm seeing, and it is particularly relevant to what's happening in the fossil fuel industry and in other businesses. A lot of people have become very wealthy on the economic structures we have today. And I see countries going into fossil fuels helter-skelter because they know that the changing world in 10, 15, 20 years' time will take away those incomes. And that is sort of translated across the community. It's another reason why I think our government in particular has found it very hard to come clean and tell us what they think they know. And, that's in spite of having parliamentarians asked to see the ONI report or parliamentary committees to see the ONI report. I mean, it is buried because, as David said, I suspect it's got in it very unpalatable truths. But you don't solve the problem by burying unpalatable truths. You solve it by sharing it with other people and being transparent. So I think we got a real way to go here to bring the community into our confidence and to show them why drastic changes are going to be needed to lifestyles, to our economy, to the way we structure our country and on. I mean, it's a very, very big problem, but we are on a collision course at the moment for existentialism.
Just while I've got you there, Chris, Drew put a question with the mainstream media being pretty complicit with denialism, and how can we change that media narrative with, the alarmist narrative is seized on and ridiculed. Any ideas on how we can change the tone, or what was the response? Who was responding to you last week? I'm assuming it probably wasn't the commercials.
Look, it wasn't. There was no hint that Sky News was interested. There was no interest from the classic Murdoch media. It was ABC, it was local radio stations and so on, and of course the Nine organisation. look, it's tough, this one. And I think trying to spread the word around is difficult because if I looked at the media landscape, I'd say people probably only look at the things that their biases support. And if their bias is they don't want to have any change, they just want the government to pay for more, just handouts, please, etc., then that's what you get. But my conception of the economy of the future sees dramatic change to the way we structure and do things. And as David pointed out, just looking at the food issues, will Australia have the luxury of being able to support itself food-wise come extraordinary heating in that part of the world, including our northern Australia? What are we going to do with mass migrations and people that want to come and live here because they think it's better than where they're leaving? How are we going to adapt to people who want to be climate refugees? What will the world economy look like? Or is the United Nations broken? Is it incapable of doing the governance that is required to solve this problem?
Emily, if I might jump in, I don't think we should be too pessimistic about the media coverage. I mean, the story last week had really good coverage on the ABC, Guardian, the Canberra Times, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, and so on. It was covered in Canberra by the Mandarin and defence reporters and so on. So I think the story gets out there. And my experience of talking and doing community work and so on is I think that people out there, people in the community get the problem. I think there is great trepidation about what's coming up. They may not articulate it, they may not be able to give you line and verse about climate science, but I think out there, look at the discussions going on about whether people should have children or not. That is driven by climate issues. So I don't think we should underestimate the current capacity of Australian people to have a sense of where we're going. I think they're pretty switched on. There's just a lack of leadership at the top because the fossil fuel industry still holds sway. I mean, we are expanding our gas exports. We are licensing new coal mines while going to the Pacific with weasel words saying, "Oh, sorry, we'll give you some aid when your countries go underwater." I mean, this is unacceptable. But I think people get it.
Well, I think you're right there. Zoe has written a comment from the audience. She wrote to the minister and got a letter back from public servants saying Labor's policy was to go over 1.5 degrees and use technology, presumably CCS, to draw down emissions later. Zoe says she's disabled and would like to know what ordinary people can do when neither major party has a climate policy in line with 1.5. I guess that's, we are coming to the end of the Q&A, but give us some hope. What can people do, particularly those people listening in tonight, do to agitate for change?
I would say cast your vote the right way around come 2025.
Yeah, and what about you, Neil, from the other side of the world?
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same. I mean, part of the problem is the narrative is frequently either there isn't a problem or we're all doomed, in which case if we're all doomed, there's not much point in doing anything, let's just have a party. The reality is we need to talk about the opportunities as well by acting, whether it be improved air quality because we're not using fossil fuels, better health, whether it be about greater certainty of energy prices because of renewables, or in this context, greater security around the world and therefore better prosperity and well-being. But at the end of the day, it's finding someone to cast a vote for who will actually act on it. Because at the moment, and again, it's not unique to climate change. I'm sitting on a continent where we've got a war raging, not many hundreds of miles away from the United Kingdom, but a lot of people aren't even taking that on board.
Yeah, I think
Ian, yeah.
I think the other issue people can do is to really start thinking about joining the dots, because we are becoming, in a media sense, extremely parochial. I mean, what people are not seeing is right around the world, wherever you look now, we are seeing extreme events which are way off the radar, whether it be China, the US, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, as well as here. It doesn't get reported very much in this country at all. And the other dimension in terms of, the main thrust, of course, is the argument about national security and the China threat and so on. But the reality is that if we keep on pushing down that path, nobody is going to solve this problem. I mean, the reality is the conflicts around the world are making this problem far worse. Just in the hard-nosed sort of emissions aspect of it in itself, apart from the distraction that's taking us away from it. So I think people need to realize that all of the cost of living concerns we have, behind it are big issues like climate, like the fact that we're creating more and more conflict, all of which is adding into people's personal discomfort in a very short-term sense. And, the policies we've got are not doing anything to get on top of that in any fundamental sense. So those dots are not being joined, and the more discussion we have on it, the better.
Thanks, Ian. And we've probably got time for one more question, and I apologise to everyone out there. The questions are fantastic, well-formed, well-educated, and all very relevant. And unfortunately, as I said before, we are moving very fast tonight. Karen Palmer has a question. As an end of PhD candidate at an Australian university working on climate science, sea level rise, she's interested in Ian's point about fractured strategy in climate science. What are the primary steps forward in improving the translation of science to risk management? And there have been a few questions on this point. Another question was, should we move out of, not move out of, but in adjunct to the scientific realm, should we bring in risk management and risk experts to try and get the politicians to listen? I think we'll start with you, Ian, and then please jump on everybody else, and then we'll probably just about have to finish up. So,
well, very quickly, I mean, the core issue I touched on earlier. I mean, the problem is that most of the risk assessment that's going on is structured around the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which basically downplay the risk. They don't look at the extremes. A lot of very good work has been done by the IPCC, but it has also been sat upon by governments, so that some of the more radical concerns that are around are not talked about. And those include the big risks of tipping points and so on. So company directors, whether they be company directors or governments or whatever, people who are doing risk management must look at the extremes of these issues and start to plan strategies that can handle them, because those are the things that are going to destroy us, and we must at all, in all events, stop occurring. So it's that sort of approach of taking it beyond what is accepted as conventional wisdom to really understand the full extent of the threat we're faced with.
Emily, if I might just jump in very briefly.
Ian
and I, and I'm sure many others have had conversations with some of Australia's leading scientists about the problem. And I think it's a problem of when things get stuck in government, the silos, the biffo between departments and agencies about money and who's going to do what and who's got the money for the model and so on. I mean, what I'm hearing from scientists, are they saying at the top of this process, we need an independent panel of scientific and risk experts who sit above this and can give some advice and try and coordinate what's going on, because it's stuck in a bureaucratic maze and it's not working. So independent expert overview, supervision and review of how we do climate science and apply it in policy and risk management.
Thank you, David. And Neil, then followed by Chris. I'll get your final thoughts as well, because as I said, we are running over time now on that question, or something you want to impart with the audience.
I think very briefly, we know enough to know that we've got to act, and we need to act now. Governments will only act when they're under pressure from the electorate. And it's in our hands as the electorate to put that pressure on governments to act in our good, in our benefit and interests.
Thanks, Neil. And Chris?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity to say a couple of simple things. First of all, I started in 2008 and was often told that if we scare the horses, people will get frightened and they won't be interested. Well, I think it's far too late to even think about those kinds of things. We have to level with people and tell them what it's really like. The second point I want to make is I see a huge shift in the science that's come around in the last sort of 5 years plus, as some of the comfortable and complacent estimates of the past have proved to be wrong. It's one of the reasons why I said I think Will Steffen might have been wrong about 2030. The way I see things, and I think David's graphs pointed to this, you look at the lags in the system and the growth in temperature changing, I think a lot of what we thought was way out in the future is suddenly going to be right up front. And that gets very scary, because as these tipping points cross over each other and get in the way, some of the effects we do not know about. It is pretty scary. And finally, there is on the Q&A, of course, a question about the other existential threat, and that is nuclear war. The point I would make is there is an inevitability about what's happening with the climate, with the Earth system that humans have generated. Nuclear war is avoidable if humans have common sense. And that's a major difference between the two things. And I think were we to have an existential threat come real on climate change, it will be ugly. It will take a long time to have its full effect. And frankly, I don't want to be here.
Thank you, Chris, on that note. Unfortunately, it's all we have time for. And again, I apologise to those people who put questions forward that we couldn't get to. They're fantastic, and I appreciate your interest and involvement tonight. I'd like to thank our speakers, Chris Barry, Ian Dunlop, David Spratt and Neil Morissetti. And thank you all for joining the conversation. It looks like we've got a lot more to say. It's been enlightening and thought-provoking and a little bit sickening, I have to admit. I don't know how well I'm going to sleep tonight with that updated information. But please remember, you can download the report at ASLCG.org, and also ASLCG.org, our fantastic group, will be sending out a link, a recording to this, so you can go over some of the fantastic presentations and also the comments made. The conversation doesn't end here. Hopefully we can work together to make climate security an urgent priority, and it sounds like it really is. Thank you all for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and help us spread the word. Good night and thank you.